you're gambling with World War III.
Это нарушает нашу безопасность, расширение НАТО.
A peacekeeping force does not exist with a ceasefire.
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Any regime attempts that create a security vacuum have been historically catastrophic.
Hello, welcome to this latest edition of the Security Brief. There really is only one place to put our focus this week, and that is on the emerging situation in the Middle East. What will the peace process look like as it unfolds militarily? What are the dangers of even getting to the first stage of this process? With me, as ever, the Security Brief's Mikey Kay, former military strategic planner. And also on the programme this week, we'll hear from Verified's Merlin Thomas. Mikey, it's great to see you.
You too.
Obviously, there is a very delicate process already underway. The Israeli troops are now in their positions, their predetermined positions, but there's a lot of people on the road. There's some very twitchy troops. It's a very dangerous time.
Yeah, it's incredibly delicate. The 72-hour window that Hamas have to release the 48 remaining Israeli hostages by midday local time in Israel on Monday. And there's this 72-hour really fragile sort of period where there's a lot of things that need to happen. You've got Israeli Defense Forces, they're withdrawing back to that predisposition line that we've spoken about. And you've got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Gazans now trying to make their way back to where their homes were. What's going to be left? The answer is probably rubble. There's going to be unexploded ordnance there. There's not going to be much food and water, if any. No sanitary arrangements. So, you know, in terms of instability, on both parties, it's a very delicate time.
Let's talk about the withdrawal over the next 24, 48 hours. The IDF say they've pulled out to these new lines, which have been marked on a map provided by the American administration. The BBC Verified's Merlin Thomas has been taking a look at that.
Israeli troops have been withdrawing from Gaza on Friday morning, and we've been verifying video circulating on social media like this, showing tanks and heavy machinery approaching and crossing the Western Erez, which is located on the Gaza Strip's northern border. Now, to recap, this is President Trump's latest plan for the first stage of Israeli troop withdrawal. You can see that here in these yellow lines. Now, it would mean Israel would still control about 55% of Gaza. Israel has already sliced the Gaza Strip into different military corridors, as you can see here in these red lines. Now, these are militarized zones and are used by the army for access to move across Gaza. In some places, you can see that the White House plan roughly matches up with some existing boundaries created by the Israeli military. It's worth emphasizing this is the latest map, but we don't know how closely this corresponds to what was finally agreed, and that will be crucial to what happens to Israeli troops on the ground. Now, Palestinians will have the chance to return home to northern Gaza, where they were ordered to flee. But what's left for them to return to? Israel has destroyed swathes of the Strip. Whole neighborhoods in Gaza City have been wiped off the map. For now, Palestinians and Israelis will be waiting anxiously in the hopes that the ceasefire agreement holds.
Mikey, the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, made a statement today, said they will stay in position, these troops, until Hamas is disarmed and until total victory has been secured, which is a pretty high bar. What does total victory look like in military terms?
Always incredibly wary of the word victory whenever a political leader uses that in this context. But for Netanyahu, total victory means Hamas disarmed and Gaza demilitarized. That's his focal point. But in my experience, using terms like total victory, they don't weather well. You know, if you go back to May 2003, there was G.W. Bush stood on the carrier, big sign behind him saying mission accomplished, declaring victory 3 months after the invasion. And that didn't go well, because after that declaration, there were over 4,500 US troops that were killed in combat, 32,000 US troops that were injured in combat at a cost of $3 trillion. So, again, always very wary about using definitive terms like victory.
The news from Washington today is that there are 200 American troops inbound that will go to Jerusalem to head up a civil military task force. What role do you think they will be taking in what happens in the next few weeks?
If I was Trump, those 200 troops, they're not going to be deployed inside Gaza. They're going to be deployed outside Gaza, inside Israel. But if I was Trump, I would be wanting for my US troops to be looking over the shoulder in command and control centers of IDF operations. Inside those command and control centers, they'll be looking at drones. The drones will be providing what's called pattern of life, so live images of areas where IDF troops are, areas of displacement migration patterns. You know, and again, if I was Trump, I would have my men in there and my women in there and my troops in there to oversee, to make sure that triggers aren't pulled easily, to make sure that rules of engagement are adhered to, and that the 72-hour process isn't quite literally blown up.
Because in that context, Netanyahu said today he's quite happy and willing to return to war if Hamas reneges on the deal. And in fact, the fighting continued right up until the ceasefire. Yeah,
I mean, it has, and it's, I wouldn't describe it so much as fighting, it's kinetic activity. And what I mean by that is it's mostly demolitions. And you're looking at, airstrikes, and I think we've got some footage of airstrikes here. They're the demolitions, and high explosives that are using just completely to obliterate all forms of infrastructure.
But we've talked before, isn't that illegal under international law to target civilian infrastructure and civilians?
Yeah, by an occupied force under the Geneva Conventions, it is. But what the IDF are saying is that there are military assets inside of that infrastructure, whether it's civilian or whether it's buildings. But given that 92% of homes have been destroyed and 60% of Gaza's entire infrastructure have been destroyed, I'd be very curious to see the IDF intelligence claims that support that.
I noticed this morning that there was an IDF reservist killed just yesterday. Yeah. So in the final actions that were going on the ground, that's 914 IDF soldiers since the war began. I think there's been quite a rise in the number of Israeli soldiers that have been targeted and killed. How have they adapted for that?
So in the period of demolition, you've had airstrikes, you've had controlled explosions, but what Israeli media are reporting now is the increased use of what have been called suicide APCs. APC stands for Armored Personnel Carrier. I'll just show you actually what this looks like. This is an M113 Armored Personnel Carrier. It's aging, it's vulnerable, it's almost obsolete in terms of the purpose that it's used for. What the Israelis have
Looks
devised...
like a First World War tank.
It absolutely does. It's not advanced by any stretch of the imagination. But the IDF have advanced this new, what we call a CONOP in the military, a concept of operations, which utilizes this vehicle. It puts a massive amount of explosives inside it. It's remote controlled, and they'll just drive this vehicle up to a building that they want to destroy, and they'll detonate it. And over the last few months, they've been doing that increasingly using this concept of operations.
And Merlin showed us the scale of the destruction using tools like that. Trump says the reconstruction will be funded by the wealthy Middle Eastern countries, but to what end and to what cost?
Yeah, the devastation is there's no other word but catastrophic. Let's take a look at some data points, actually. We kind of touched upon them earlier. 60% of buildings destroyed and 92% of homes destroyed. That's just the infrastructure piece. Then you've got to look at the devastation when it comes to human casualties. You've got 67,000 dead, 18,000 children. If we go to some more imagery, this is satellite imagery of Tal al-Sultan area, which is a refugee camp in Rafah, as you know, because you've been there, which is in the south. So this is 2 years ago. And then as the screen wipes, you'll see the devastation that's occurred to August this year. And it is significant. You just look at the way that wipes across. The grey area on the right.
Yeah.
There's just nothing left there.
In terms of, first things first, you've got to clear the rubble. But do we know what's underneath the rubble?
You don't. There's over 40 million tons of it. So you don't know what's underneath there. And the first point from that, Christian, is that, when we talk about 67,000 killed and 18,000 children, I think that number's got to be much higher, because unless you know what's under the rubble, you're not going to have really the accurate figures. So the data points, I think, are low, and we won't know what the reality is until years later once the rubble's been cleared. And as I said, it's 40 million tons, and with 100 trucks a day, according to UNRWA, and it's their estimates, it'll take 15 years to complete at a cost of $500 million. Now, a major problem under all this rubble is unexploded ordnance. That's basically, you've got all these airstrikes coming in, and not all of them will be successful. So you'll have ordnance in there, buried in that rubble, that is unexploded, and that's massively dangerous for hundreds of thousands of people moving back into those communities. So to put this into perspective, I was filming with an NGO in central Vietnam, who 50 years later was still working to clear UXO, unexploded ordnance, from the Vietnam War. So this is going to take decades.
And when it comes to stability on the ground, the 20-point plan, of course, involves or includes this international stabilization force, the ISF. Now, you deployed as part of one of these peacekeeping forces to Afghanistan, I think, to Kosovo, Macedonia, Iraq. So you've a lot of experience of this.
Iraq wasn't the peacekeeping force, but the other three were Afghanistan, Macedonia, and Kosovo.
So how do you think it will work?
Well, I mean, the primary aim of the International Stabilization Force, which needs to be figured out, the 200 US troops that we were talking about are not part of that ISF agreement. But some of the key objectives will be, ensuring the disarming of Hamas.
How do you verify that?
It's through a process. So when you mentioned Macedonia, the operation that I was on was called Operation Essential Harvest in 2001. And they use a process, a ratified process called DDR, which is disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate. And effectively what that's doing is it's setting up collection points where Hamas, in this case, would be able to come under amnesty, drop off their weapons. All of those weapons are collected, and then Hamas will be given amnesty to relocate with dependents inside of civil communities. So that's the disarming bit. Then you've got the training of vetted Palestinian forces, and then providing long-term security. These are sort of much longer aims of the internationalization.
But that's the interesting part for me, because thinking back to Iraq, one of the big mistakes was not making use of the remnants of the security structure that was there, the Ba'athist security structure. You left a vacuum, they filled it, and then you had real problems with the insurgents throughout the country. Surely the Americans, the Israelis have to provide a Palestinian police force, at least a police force that can maintain order across the Strip.
Yeah, the point you make about the Ba'athist Party is a really important one. Let me just build on that for a second. You had Paul Bremer, which was the head of the Transitional Authority that was put in by G.W. Bush. He fired 400,000 Iraqi troops. That creates a security vacuum. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was allowed to build in that security vacuum, and ultimately it went on to be partly the cause of the generation of the Islamic State. In terms of the training and mentoring, I think the most recent examples are in Afghanistan. I deployed twice to Afghanistan, where the US, the Brits and NATO were training the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, which takes, and this is the important point, this takes decades. It's not going to happen in months or years.
Do you see a vacuum on the ground, though? Clearly, obviously, the Hamas leadership has been taken out. Most of the leadership is outside the country. Is that dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, there's an investigation by another news organisation that has identified what were called looting gangs to begin with. They're now called popular forces. And according to this investigation, they also link Israel to funding them. So you can already see that there's a positioning as an alternative to Hamas through other groups. There are other militia groups who have already dedicated allegiance to these so-called popular forces. And I think when there's a security vacuum, these popular forces or militia groups are allowed to effectively operate with impunity. And, this isn't just a Israeli MO. The US have been doing this, remember the Free Syrian Army in Syria. So it's not a...
So with that in mind, final question, the mandate for the ISF, the rules of engagement, who sets that?
So historically, it would go to the United Nations Security Council. On that, you've got Russia, China, United States, France, and the United Kingdom. But that's been in paralysis. You know that, Christian, over the last, almost decade since 2012. That's been in paralysis. What they would normally do is they would vote on a Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 peacekeeping operation. Chapter 6 is peacekeeping operations without the use of force, approved force. Chapter 7 with peacekeeping operations with approved force. They are very rarely approved. And because of the paralysis of the P5, unlikely to be in this case. So the other options for the US and Israel is to seek some form of multinational force. But the key bit here, Christian, is that any multinational force needs to include security forces and political buy-in from the regions. So the obvious organisation there is the Arab League. And that's critical for any multinational force to have credibility and longevity.
Really interesting. Of course, we will continue to keep an eye on it. Just a reminder that if you missed any of this particular security brief, or you want to look at the former episodes, the other episodes that there are. They're all there on YouTube. Do go and have a look at that. Mikey, thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.